welcome Coach Jon. Jon is here with us today and he'll be sharing with us more insights on reconciliation. You have a perception on how we should work with the brain. I like what I've read about you. You talk about working with the brain instead of against it. The statement itself, it's massive. Please help us understand it.
Yeah, well, I think about, and I'll put my Christian lens on it as well. Let's say I was raised in, I'll call it like a fairly fundamentalist Christian group, and as such, there's a lot of shame around sin and struggle, and it's not that we're permissive of sin, but it can also lead to what I'll call performative Christianity, where obedience precedes love. That's in the wrong sequence. Because Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Don't keep my commandments to show me that you love me. That's a small but significant distinction. And so our brain is wired in a certain way, whether it's for survival, it's wired for keeping things consistent and keeping us safe. And so a lot of times when we struggle with something like sin, we may look at our behaviors in a certain way and say, I am a terrible person for having this struggle, when in fact, we're just behaving in a way that's consistent with how our brain actually works. So when I'm having a binge eating episode or engaging in any kind of substance use or things like that, part of it is my brain seeking for escape, seeking for relief, seeking for something that's not what I'm presently feeling or experiencing. It doesn't mean the behavior is helpful, but it means the behavior is understandable. And I often use this phrase, I will say, compassionate awareness becomes the foundation of transformational change. Now, there's a lot of things that are also captured in that phrase. But the ability to, you see, all of our sin is ever known before God. It's not surprising to God that we sin. God understands us as our creator. But we struggle with the shame of our sin because we realize it creates separation between us and God. But we're prone to it because of how we're created. And so that in itself creates a need of God. If we can let go of the shame and the stories that tell us how horrible and worthless we are, and recognize that we're actually very precious to God, in that we can bring our sin to him and say, hey, I'm struggling, I need help. And it's almost like God would say, yes, I know, and I understand. I think about Jesus, who sits at God's right hand as our advocate and our intercessor, saying, I lived as a man, I lived the struggles, I understand the struggles. He didn't say to people, keep doing the thing that's hurting you, but rather he said, let me help you, because your struggles make sense. I'll use one example from the Bible. The woman who was caught in adultery and had multiple husbands and partners, worthy of death under the old law, but Jesus could look into her heart and say, I know why you're doing what you're doing. You are looking for something you cannot find in those patterns of behavior. He didn't use those words, of course, I'm paraphrasing. But he could say, I know why you're doing what you're doing, and it's not because you're a terrible human being. It's because you're in struggle and you're trying to solve a problem, you're trying to meet a need that cannot be met by what you're doing. And that's when he would say, I will give you water to drink, that if you drink this water, you'll never thirst again. I will give something that satisfies the need you're trying to fulfill through those behaviors that can't.
When you use that analysis, you might be helping us find one reason why people know there is God, but they don't want to walk with him. A problem that you've already solved. And now I'm beginning to think, do we have a particular laziness in our brain that just refuses to explore more of God? Why do you think some people want just to belong and don't want to take a closer walk with God?
I would say, so it's funny, I very rarely use the word lazy because I have this expression. So just to quickly give people an understanding, in my professional work, I'm a health coach. I'll call it a systems integration coach, which sounds very buzzwordy. But essentially, I combine things like fitness, nutrition, sleep, stress management, nervous system health, psychology, and neuroscience. I combine all these different elements together to help people live healthier lives as a whole. And when relevant, when someone's open to it, we may also talk about Christian principles as well. It's only ever if the door opens for that. I don't, but anyways, so I have a very, very strong understanding of human physiology in multiple domains as well. And that sort of informs the work. Now, the reason for that backstory is a lot of times what we might describe as lazy, I would describe as weariness. So there's a certain expectation that we should behave in a certain way, and we have difficulty accepting time and a place for rest. I feel like when someone is well rested and when they have purpose in their lives, so they're not going to be lazy, but they're going to tend to want to engage in something meaningful or purposeful. But when we think about God, when we think about death, when we think about life, when we think about eternity, when we think about the infinite, omniscient, omnipotent God, that can be a terrifying thing to consider. And so in that, we have kind of two choices. We can shrink away in fear. We can, in a sense, keep ourselves at a, might I say, a safe distance from God because we're scared of trying to acknowledge, and really we can't, of course, in our human brain actually comprehend the fullness of God. But we're going to create distance between us and God, not necessarily because we are, again, trying to be defiant, but we're actually terrified by the reality of it. And one of the things I've, especially in recent years in my Christian journey, I've thought, I would like to get to the place where I'm not afraid of death. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't maintain a survival instinct. Of course, God has given us that. But it's rather to not live with this existential dread. I really think that hinders people. I think what Jesus said, I think it was to Philip, when he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What is he really saying in that? He said, the way that I move and interact with you, speak to you, feel about you, the compassion I have for you, the desire I have for you to help you, and I'm literally an agent of the Father. You are seeing the Father's nature and love embodied in me. And so sometimes I think there's this idea that God is in the eternal realm sitting there with a sledgehammer waiting to crush us for our mistakes, when in fact he sent Jesus to suffer for our sins to reconcile us to him. And maybe this would be the other part of it, is we think about God as an angry, vengeful, punitive father, not one who wants to, yet we see the Father's heart again in the parable of the prodigal son, someone who runs to meet the one who's lived a ruinous life and saying, I'm so glad you're back because I want to share this with you. That's the heart of our God. But if we are raised to believe more in the punitive, and it doesn't say there, I'm not going to pretend there's not wrath and judgment and things like that. I'm not trying to make it sound like God is just a fluffy, teddy bear here. But what I mean is, if we see the deep heart of God, it is for us to be reconciled to him and ultimately through Jesus and what he accomplished on the cross. But it's a terrifying thing to think about. We have to move through that, move closer to God, because we are mortal and we are finite. And that in itself can be a terrifying realization, until we realize that Jesus conquered death.
This is the time for you to tell our audience what you do. Thank you.
freedomnutritioncoach.com is where you can find me. The website itself probably needs to grow and be updated. I have a new kind of umbrella company in the background describing the fullness of what I do. But common the way that people find me is wanting to improve their health or weight loss or things like that. And so that website is still there. I'm relatively quiet on social media right now, which is why I steer people towards the website. There will be some new things emerging probably this year at some point in time. It's just a matter of capacity. It's not that I'm unreachable. I have quite a full schedule. I still have room in it, but I have quite a full schedule. I have a lot of people that I work with. It just so happens that when you do kind of the unique work that I do and people start to learn about it, people start to talk about it and find their way to me somehow. But there, if people do want to, you can see there's a link. You can book a 30-minute chat with me, no charge. We can just have a talk about whatever's going on in your life and figure out if I'm able to help you or not. And most people, I would say, you have that chat and you'll leave with a different perspective on yourself, on your health, on your life. And that's why I offer that, because sometimes that's all people need is a change of perspective from one conversation.
Thank you very much. Our guest this week is Jonathan McLennon. We are ending here with this episode, and we will be back very soon. Please stay updated. Please consider subscribing to make sure you do not miss the next